Greetings and welcome to today's hour-long painting lesson. Today we are going to be painting a lighthouse out on the ocean. We're going to be doing a bright afternoon sky. It's something we don't do a lot of on the channel, but something I'm looking forward to playing with more in the future. And I'd like to note that this video, this is an hour-long lesson. It is a new series to the channel. We launched the first one last week, and I wasn't sure how it was going to go over. I tried posting an hour-long lesson mid last year and it didn't come out to overwhelmingly positive responses. And I didn't know how this next one would be received. I knew that I wanted to do longer videos because it meant I got to teach more, I got to teach more intricate subjects and better lessons, but I didn't know how everyone would react to it. And looking back on it a week from when it was posted, I can't believe the positive response to it. I was overwhelmingly impressed, overjoyed, all of it, by the amount of likes, the amount of comments, the amount of just engagement throughout social media. And it felt like we were really making something that everybody cared about, and that meant a lot. So thank you for making that such an overwhelming success and something to feel proud of, and really making this feel like the community I've always wanted it to feel like. So truly thank you for that. I'd also like to say a big thank you to everyone over on the Alpine level of Patreon for making the new exclusive Facebook group feel like such a community already. I feel like I've already seen so many conversations, so many amazing pieces of art, and I'm going to put some of them up here on the screen right now just to say thank you, and because they're so good. But I'm really impressed by the amount of positivity and feedback I'm seeing in that group, people helping each other with their paintings, giving positive support. And I saw one conversation in particular where it was, hey, I'm having issues in that my acrylics are drying too quickly because I live in a place where there just isn't any moisture in the air. What can I do about it? And then I saw other people jump in and be like, hey, you know what, I have the same issue because I live in a similar climate and I use this product and this and these work. And just seeing that, the fact that people are going there for help and that they are receiving help is a wonderful thing. I love seeing your work. I love that I'm able to engage with your work there and have it all organized in one place. And I love what that's already becoming 1 week in. So truly thank you for making that what it is already. Again, all of you, beautiful job, beautiful work. I'm proud to put it on the screen here before our video. I suppose also, while I'm talking about Patreon, I should note that today we are painting a lighthouse, which is a structure. It has a lane towards it. We're working on a larger canvas. And because of all of those things, we're able to do a much more detailed drawing. And I know a lot of you like to paint. You are here for painting, not necessarily drawing. It's not necessarily the strong suit, and you just like to get to the painting. So if you'd like to kind of skip over the drawing process, get that image on the canvas much more easily, there is the digital sketch up over on Patreon. You can also find the reference photo up over on Patreon as well to help you get additional ideas and play with different things. But all of that is there. Patreon is also just a great way to say thank you and support the channel. So all of that said, thank you for, again, all of the positive feedback. I look forward to reading the comments in today's video, and I want to, again, jump into the video, but I'll show you the materials first, and then we'll get into the painting. Again, the full, uncut, hour-long painting. So let's do just that. Here today we'll be using a cadmium red medium hue, a cadmium yellow deep hue, a bright aqua green, a cerulean blue, a light blue permanent, a burnt umber, a burnt sienna, titanium white, and Mars black. With that said, you don't need all of these fancy blues and other colors. You could stick to the primary colors with some burnt umber and your painting will turn out quite nicely. I just wanted to expand, try some different mixes, and come up with some new fun things as well. With that said, let's talk about brushes. So here you can see our ocean view, lighthouse, and laneway to guide us into the painting, all drawn out here on the canvas, and we're just about ready to start. With that said though, I would like to take a quick moment to talk about the varying materials that we have allotted to us for this lesson. Just because, while they'll all be listed in the description, sometimes I know it helps to visually see them, that way you know if you need something, what you're going out and looking for, or why we're using it. So to begin, I have a regular canvas here, and you'll see some grid lines drawn on there, you'll see some different markings and implications done. All of that was done with these woodless colored pencils, which I really like because they don't tend to dilute paint in the same way charcoal or graphite do. If I did all of my drawing here with a charcoal and a graphite and I used a delicate color like the yellow or the white, it can dilute it, it can change the pigment, they can kind of blend together and become kind of muddy, and we don't want that. So far, I've been using these for about 1.5 years now, and I haven't had that issue once. So I would highly recommend these for the initial sketch. With that said, once I have that initial sketch, I like to go over all of my detailed areas with this ultra fine point Sharpie. And I like to use this because it essentially keeps my drawing on the canvas regardless of how messy I am with my initial layers of paint. So I personally like to paint my paintings by doing the backgrounds first, all of the larger areas, so I'll work on the sky, the water, and then I'll move into all of this. But when I paint the sky and the water, I like to have a very free-moving hand. I don't want to be too worried about going over these lines or covering things up. So with this drawing done in this fine-tipped marker, I can ensure essentially that I can go over all of these lines and I'm not going to lose any of them. They'll show through the first couple layers of pigment, as acrylic paints are innately fairly transparent, and this is a very stark line work. So that just really helps the process and kind of makes it much more streamlined so I don't have to go back and redraw things too frequently. Now with that said, over here for brushes, I have an older square-headed brush. We'll go into detail about that in a little bit, but you can make one very simply by just peeling back the bristles of a regular flat or square-headed brush until you have something that's a little more disheveled. Now I have 2 round-headed brushes. These are great for fog, mist, clouds, all of that good stuff, everything with kind of a soft feathered edge. Then I have 5 varying sizes of square-headed or flat-headed brushes. And I like these a lot because they hold a lot of paint and because they have this sharp edge, which is fantastic for working on sharp lines for things like rocks, roads, really anything, horizon lines. They're also great because you can use the corners of them as fine points for painting intricate areas. So that essentially is the brief overview of our brushes. We'll talk more about each in the actual painting, and I will measure them as we go so that you have a better reference point for how big they are. With that said, I wouldn't worry too much about the size. Work intuitively rather than by a script. Now, with all of that said, here I have some water in a dish, I have a cloth, my glass palette. I use a picture frame because it's very easy to clean and just kind of scrape off the excess paint. With that said, be very careful because occasionally they can break while cleaning them. I'd also recommend using a typical palette as they have no potential issues with breakage. That I know of anyways, unless you're being very rough with them. But with that said, let's now talk about the pigment itself. These aren't all of the pigments I'll be using. Again, they'll be listed in the description, but this is what I'm starting with. Here I have a titanium white, a Mars black, a cerulean blue hue. Here I have a light blue permanent, a bright aqua green, and a cadmium yellow deep hue. These are essentially going to be for my sky and my water. This is going to turn these colors a little bit more green and interject an additional color into our painting, which wouldn't once be there, just to make it a little bit more interesting. It's going to give it also a bit more of an oceany feel as well. So with that said, let's actually start the painting process. Here, I'm going to take my larger square-headed brush, as you can see here. I'm going to dip the tip of it in water, and before I forget, I'm also going to measure it. It is about 3/4 of an inch. It is almost 2 centimeters. That said, we're working on a large area, we're working on the sky. If you wanted to go bigger, I think that would also be a good choice. Now I'm going to begin by taking some titanium white, moving that out here onto the palette, and then I'm going to grab just a bit of this light blue permanent. You can use the primary colors like primary blue and titanium white. This is just going to give us a slight variance and make things a little more interesting and kind of quicken the color mixing process a little bit as well. But here you can see I have a good amount of that, and then I'm going to head onto my canvas and follow the horizon line. As you can see, I'm getting a very sharp edge down here, and I'm able to drag my paint as far as I am because my brush is damp from the water, which extends its wet life and helps me drag it out a bit farther as well. So here I'll grab a little bit more, grab some extra paint, start on this side, and just drag that. As soon as it starts to get chalky or I start to lose it, I do like to get a little bit more water and paint, as I don't want to just keep dragging it out, as that will make the pigment more thin and I'll get less quality layers. You also might start to see lines like this showing through if you are kind of negligent with that. So, with that said, I'm just creating this very simple base layer at our horizon to begin with, making sure it's relatively thick. Then we'll move up in the sky. And I'll start to grab some of this cerulean blue and work that in there as well. As you can see, it's much darker. We'll throw in some extra titanium white to brighten it up. And then we'll apply that right on top. And as you can see, they're not touching quite yet. I'm going to go back in and do that blend in just a second, but I want a good application of paint on here first. That way I have a lot to work with. Now that I do, I'm going to start blending the two together. And I'm working on an angle, kind of diagonally. That way I'm grabbing one color, moving it into the next, grabbing this color, moving it into that one, grabbing this color, moving it into that one, and just working back and forth. This doesn't give us the typical soft horizon, but now it kind of has this effect of clouds in the background. And it was very simple. It was a very easy blend. If you want to soften some of them, you can take this brush and then you can kind of go over some of these areas with horizontal strokes, and it'll smooth it all out. And I'll do that in a couple of areas, but I'll leave some of these strokes as they're quite interesting. And that's not a bad thing. Now I'm going to move up in the sky. I'm going to make it a little bit darker again, so I'll add in a bit more of that cerulean blue. Just like that. And I'll apply that to the top. Now as you can see, I didn't really get that far. I don't have a lot of water on my brush, and I don't have a lot of paint on my palette. So you know what, I will mix a good amount more. And I'm continuously mixing it on top of / beside my initial mixture. That way I have a good reference point of what I'm trying to make specifically. Here you can see now I remixed my color. My brush is wet and I get all of this distance with my pigment, which is really nice. Now yet again I have that kind of hard line between the two pigments, so I'm going to clean off my brush fairly well, wipe off that excess, and then we'll blend. Working in that same diagonal pattern. There we go. And then again, we can soften some areas if we see fit. But here, yet again, you see all of these extra little markings in the canvas that really look like nice clouds. And we're just going to create this nice little afternoon sky. I asked over on Patreon a little while ago what everyone wanted to see in skies, what their favorite color of sky was, and I was blown away by the amount of interest there was in just a pretty blue afternoon sky. So that's what we're doing here today. Now, I have that there, and we're going to continue working on the sky, but I'm going to switch over to my larger of the two round-headed brush. This is not very large though. It's still quite small if I'm going to put a ruler up to it. It's about 1/2 centimeter or 1/4 inch. I'm saying both measurements because I know we don't all use the same measurements, and hopefully it's kind of helpful. But with that said, I'm going to begin in the same way by dipping that into some water. I'm going to grab some of our titanium white, move it out here on the palette. Right next to my mixture of darker blue, I'm going to grab the light blue permanent again. I'm going to mix those two together, and this is going to be a color for some clouds up high. So for this, I'm going to start by picking an area that's kind of open, that doesn't have any new clouds in it. And I'm just going to paint in a couple different shapes. And I'm trying to make them diverse, different from one another. And I'm just kind of tapping my brush almost randomly on the palette, or on the canvas rather. Now, the more you touch them up, the more you blend them, the softer they get, the more transparent. So I'm going around to the edges with a little bit of a tapping motion. And as you can see, it's blending it into the sky. And I'm getting a very transparent edge. The round-headed brush is definitely helping with this. And it's just making for a very soft look to our clouds. I like that a lot. Kind of makes them look like they're moving in the sky. And then as I move away from the larger one here, that's up in the top left-hand corner, they just get smaller and smaller, which gives us a bit of additional depth and makes it more interesting. Now as you're up here, you're probably going to pick up some of this blue paint, which you can move back down into here and kind of create some lines and separation in clouds and give them some extra depth as well, which is fairly interesting. Here you can see I'm still just doing a little bit more of that tap and moving it about. Now let's grab some more of that highlighted pigment and build it back up on top of our clouds. I'm allowing the tops of them to be a bit more sharp, a bit more full, and then the bottoms are that very transparent flowing pigment that transitions into the other blue. Let's throw another one right here. So again, I'm going to use a little bit of a tapping motion, a little bit of a swirl with my brush, soften the bottoms, and I'll keep the top nice and sharp. Now I'm running out of paint, so I'll mix up a little bit more, just like this. And now I'll throw some of this down here and just thicken some of these larger clouds as well. Make them a little bit more notable. See that? You can have different levels and depths in clouds. Here you have some that are more blue, more transparent, and then right on top of it I have this very defined, sharp looking cloud. And again, it's that combination that's really going to give your painting a lot of depth and interest. Just because it's a calm afternoon sky doesn't mean you can't still incorporate a lot of beautiful detail and make the painting interesting. There we go. Now I'm looking at the painting and I'm feeling like this side is a little bit darker than this one, and I want to make this stand out slightly more. So I'm going to connect these two clouds and make kind of a much larger one that commands more attention. So I'm just connecting them, and this is an easy way of making your clouds more interesting as well. It's starting from little clouds and then just kind of adding bridges between them so that you can combine them and create entirely new shapes that you wouldn't think of naturally or subconsciously. A lot of the strokes we do in painting, at least initially, are subconscious, and they're very similar to one another. So you want to kind of break that pattern and make things as interesting as you can. And an easy way to do that, again with clouds, is create a number of them in the sky, different sizes, different shapes, and then just start connecting them to one another. And that will definitely help you along the way. Here you can also see that while I'm covering my lighthouse with paint, I can still see it for the most part. And that's all because I chose the right drawing tools. There we are. Now, sometimes when you do this little tapping motion, if you have a lot of paint, you're really not going to get that smooth of a blend. Instead, you'll still get these markings, but they'll just be a little bit darker, in which case you can just go back over them with a damp brush, and it will actually soften them and create that transition that you want. Just be aware that it won't always have the exact same effect. It will change depending upon the amount of paint and water that you have on your brush. And mastering that is something that takes time, but will be really nice in the end. Here I'm just going back up and softening some more clouds. And now I'm going to do something that is very important in painting, and that's taking a couple of steps back. So I'm physically getting up, I'm moving behind the camera about 5 feet away, and I'm giving the painting a good look to make sure that it's coming along in the way that I like. Sometimes when we start working on areas like these clouds, we get hyper-focused on that area, and we forget to look at the painting as a whole. And so here, I'm stepping back, I'm looking back at it, and I'm making sure that everything works cohesively, and that the sides are doing what I want them to do. So, from there, it's definitely looking much more balanced. This is much more prominent as I wanted it to be, but I'm going to add a little bit more to it. And you know what? I think we might connect this cloud back down to this one again. Just create a much larger, more interesting piece. Now it kind of has this hole in it, which is fun. I think probably most all of us as kids kind of looked up at clouds and said, hey, what do you think that looks like? Hey, what's that? And it's these strange intricacies that give clouds that personality and that nostalgic factor as well. So here I'm just softening the bottoms now that I've connected them. And then we can do interesting little things in and around it as well. There we go. Now yet again, I've just done something large to the painting. I'm going to step back, really assess, and you know what? I like that a lot. I think that worked out extremely well. So, now that I'm happy with that, I'm going to move down here into the water of the painting. And for this process, I am once again standing up. I'm not sitting down, and I'm doing that because I want this to be a little bit more free moving. I want a little bit more of a loose stroke than control. Generally, if you want control, you sit down, you work. If you want looseness, you kind of stand up and you move your body with it. So here, I'm going to use this same medium-sized brush. We could move over to the larger ones if you wanted to kind of speed it up, but I'm not too worried about that right now. I'm going to use this one, and I'm going to make the water, darker, because the water is generally, for the most part, darker than the sky, and I'm going to incorporate some greens into it. So this is the darkest color we have in the painting currently. We want to make something darker, so I'll take some of that, move it right here. Then I'm going to grab a little bit of our cadmium yellow deep hue, move that in. It's going to give it just a hint of green, which is important. Then I'm going to blend it out really well because I don't want some portions of it to be more green than others, some to have hints of yellow. I want it to be consistent. Same goes with my brush. Then I'm going to grab just a hint of Mars Black. You can see it's just on the corner of my brush. There isn't much at all, and that's because it's such a strong pigment. As you can see, it's already having a very big effect down here. And now I'm going to apply this with some horizontal strokes into the background of the painting. And I'm going to have it occasionally connect, but I'm making them on different levels, different tiers, making it more interesting and trying to keep it evolving. There we are. See, we have little openings in different areas, but the background is going to be the darkest, and then we'll get a little bit lighter as we move into the foreground. There we go. Lots of these horizontal strokes. When waves are very far away, they optically create clusters, and then those clusters create shape, and then you're kind of just left with horizontal lines. As you move forward, you see more waves and more detail, but in the background it's generally fairly simple. Now I'm going to want to fill in all of those areas and of course move forward in the painting. So I'm going to start by using a little bit of a brighter color, so I'll take this now. I'll take some of that extra blue and I'll create a mixture of those two. And I'm doing it half with the pigment we just had, that way I know it's a natural transition from one to the next, and I can see visually just how much brighter it is, which is important as well. So now I'm going to take this and I'm just going to work it into the openings that we have. And as you can see, there isn't the most stark difference, but it's a little detail that in person can be really beautiful and differentiate areas of your painting. There we go. Make sure that your brush is still frequently nice and damp. That isn't something you want to forget. Here I'm continuing. Lots of these nice horizontal strokes. And the line back here isn't absolutely perfect, but we can touch that up a little bit later, and I'll show you a good easy trick for doing that. But don't worry about that too much at this point. We are doing this for the most part freehand, as you can see. Now I'm going to take this color and I'm going to move into the foreground now with more of these horizontal lines, yet again leaving these white open spaces for us to fill in just a little bit. It's all about creating natural transitions, keeping things cohesive. There we are. So now, yet again, as we move forward, we're going to need to brighten up this pigment. So this time, I'm going to take a little bit of our bright aqua green, and I'm going to throw that into our mixture with some titanium white. And yet again, you can see the transition. Here we have the darkest, here we have the one we just applied, and here is our new pigment, which is going to work quite well. So there you can see, yet again, it's not wildly different from the last pigment we applied, but you can see that it is very different from that darkest pigment that we used initially. So while our mixes aren't immediately very different from one another, they do add up to be very different over time. And it's trusting that process. A lot of beginners tend to change colors very dramatically, very quickly, because it's this fear that, oh no, it won't show up, it won't be enough of a difference. But in actuality, you'll get the most subtle, beautiful, interesting transitions when you do take your time, when you apply it at a natural pace. And you don't take those jumps and say, oh no, I need this to be more vibrant, before you've really even tested it. Here, as you can see, we're moving along. We have all of these nice colors showing through. And I'm making these shorter strokes, and I'll show you again what I mean. Making a stroke. It's not this long stroke. It's segmented, it's small, and because of that we get this effect of almost rippling water in the distance, which is really neat. Now I'm going to grab a little bit of our darker pigments that we still have here on the palette, and I'm just going to do a couple more of those short strokes up here in the foreground. It's going to blend with the pigments we just applied, so it's not going to look as dark or stark as it does in the background, which is good, but it is going to give it a little bit more interest. Just like that. Don't need a lot of them. We'll just kind of space them out and make sure they're nice and interesting. Just like that. Now, I'm going to clean my brush yet again. Don't want any acrylics drawing on our brush, as that will harden in it and make it very thick, and at that point you won't be able to clean it. I say this in almost every video, but I've had these brushes for about 2 years now, year and a half, 2 years, and that's because I wash them frequently. They're not expensive brushes, they're very inexpensive actually, but I take care of them, and that makes all the difference. Now, from there, again, we're going to continue moving forward in the painting. So, what do? We make it brighter. And we mix it right beside, / on top, our last mixture. That way we have a reference point. Now I'm starting here with my light blue permanent. I'm going to grab, again, a little bit of my bright aqua green. I'm going to blend those two together. You can see they're a little bit brighter. I'm going to throw in a little bit of titanium white. And I'm going to blend them here on my palette, our previous color and our new color, a little bit. That way, again, it's nice and cohesive. And now I'll start throwing in this pigment as well. And I'll do so with these short little applications. As you can see, I'm going over my rocks, my previous drawings, and I'm not worried about it because, again, it will show through. It isn't going to be an issue. Now, as you can see, this is really quite green. Or, it's not green. It's not truly quite green, but it's quite green in relation to the rest of the canvas. And this goes back to what I was saying about doing things in a measured application, in a measured gradient, in a measured time. And if I step back from the painting right now, I can see that there isn't that much of a transition between the blue and the green. So I'm going to go back to my palette. I'm going to take some of the blue that I have saved on the side here. I'm just going to work that back into the green through these short little strokes. And these strokes that I'm creating were initially wholly horizontal. Right now, I'm starting to make them slightly diagonal and moving them into one another. And that's because we're starting to see pattern in the wave as it gets closer to us. So initially, my stroke was like this. Now it might be like this. So they might connect and touch, and that's an extreme example, but a proper one at that. So as you move farther down, start to give a little bit more of an angle to your painting. Now I'm going to throw a little bit of extra blue into our current color. As you can see, it's making it a little bit darker. Throwing a little bit extra titanium white. It's still slightly brighter than our last pigment, but it is a little bit more blue, and that's what I want. I'm going to work this into the bluish green that we had. And again, just continue to cultivate that transition. There we are. See, that's looking much more natural. I like that a lot. I'll throw this blue down here. Remember, these lines are no longer just straight. I'm moving them up, down, diagonally. Getting a fair bit of paint on there, recognizing that it will blend with the future applications. Just like that. And now we'll continue moving forward in the painting, as we have, by taking more of our green. We can go back to that, mix that in there, take some titanium white, mix that in there. Yet again, we're back to a very bright pigment. Should work well. And now I'm filling in the other areas while loosely going over the ones we've just created, creating slight blends, but not intentionally. I'm just letting it happen naturally. That's one of the beautiful things about painting in ocean. You can get this very natural effect by painting cathartically. Not worrying too much about process or line, but just kind of letting it happen. There we go. Grab a little bit extra titanium white, mix that in there. Create some highlighted areas now. And this will look like waves kind of capping up. And as waves move out of the ocean, out of the water, they get more and more thin. Less water is there in that body. And in turn, more light can pass through it and brighten it, which is why you get these nice, bright tops to our waves. So here I'm just throwing them in. I'm letting them blend with the currently wet layers, that way it isn't too stark. And if you find your previous layer is already dried, just add a little bit of extra water to your brush, and that should make it so it blends wet into dry, rather than what I'm currently doing, which is for the most part wet into wet. I like both wet into wet and wet into dry. I think they both work well in varying scenarios, and I think you can make both work in almost every scenario. So I wouldn't worry too much about that, but recognize that you shouldn't worry. That you can make it work. Just practice, be diligent, all of that. Now here I'm going to take some light blue permanent yet again. I'm going to move that over here on my palette, right next to my current brightest color. And I'm going to try to create a blue that's a similar brightness to the blue-green. And I'm just creating this and applying it to create something that's a little bit different from what we currently have. If we were to paint all of it in the foreground with that blue-green, then it would actually look kind of dull. We wouldn't have any depth, we wouldn't have any contrast. Remember, things only look very bright when they're next to things that are quite dark, and vice versa. It's that contrast which is going to make things noticeable. Here I'm just taking some of that brighter pigment and moving it into the middle ground, just to make it a little bit more interesting. Now I'm cleaning my brush off quite well, as you can see, and then I'm going to take a couple of steps back from my painting and give it a proper, fair look over. Because again, it's so easy to just zoom in and zero in on these areas and kind of optically fool yourself as to what it actually looks like. So that's what I'm going to do right now. After taking a couple of steps back, I realized that this area is really void of contrast. So I'm going to mix up a medium blue right on top of our previous blue, that way I have a good reference point. And I'm going to start to interject a little bit of additional contrast in there. So here you can see I'm just mixing up something that'll look in complement with this, and I think that'll look quite nice. And now I'll go back and forth, create some of these lines, let it blend, and create some additional detail in the water. That first stroke was very stark, so I just took some of that extra paint and started to move it about in the painting. There we go. And then, I'm going to clean my brush quite well, dry it off. We already have a lot of wet paint, wet water on the canvas right now, so I don't want my brush to be too wet. And I'm just going to blend the edges fairly softly and kind of have them transition into the blue. And this is just going to give it a bit of a softer look. It's going to make it look a little bit less like brush strokes. I still like the brush stroke look, but it's going to soften it a little bit. Just like that. And let us play with the size of the stroke a little bit more. So I'm stepping back again, and that definitely has more detail. But now, if you look here, that really looks like the brightest area in the water, and I kind of like to bring that back down here a little bit. So I'm going to take more titanium white, more of our aqua green, mix that into our blue, and then I'll just work that down here again. So I'm just working back and forth until I get what I want. It's okay if it doesn't happen the first time. It's important that we learn, figure out why things didn't work the way we wanted them to, and then adjust and make them better. Here you can see I'm throwing a lot of that green in. Now I'll take some extra titanium white, mix that in there, make it a little bit brighter. Throw this in. And there you can see some of that real color popping, creating something nice and stark. There we go. Like that a lot. Now I'm going to step back and yet again reevaluate. And that to me looks much better. So from there, I'm going to show you how we fix the horizon line. I'm going to take some green tape. This generally doesn't hurt the canvas or the paint. And this can only be done when your paint is fully dry. So we've waited a good amount of time. The sky is fully dry. I'm going to put this up to the sky and leave a little bit of room in between. Now I'll take my larger brush, I'll mix up that same very dark blue that we had initially, and then I'll just go over that line. Just like this. Very, very simple. I'm still doing it in a little bit of a tapping motion, that way some areas are slightly thicker and more dark than others, and it'll just make it slightly more interesting. Now, generally, I would advise letting it dry, but I think we added a small enough amount of paint that I can just kind of take this off and see how it looks. And we have a, not perfect, as you can see right there, but much more straight line, and you can make it much more perfect by waiting a little bit and just being slightly more precious with your stroke. But that's definitely a good start, and I like that a lot. Now, I'm going to switch to this smaller square-headed brush. I'm sitting back down because I'm going to do some detail work. And I'm going to measure it for you. It's about a 1/2 centimeter. It's almost, but not quite, 1/4 inch. No, yeah, about that. So, yes. Sometimes when you move between measurements, I kind of get confused. I'm a little bit dyslexic, but with that said, we're good, we're on track. So I'm going to take this small brush, make sure that it's nice and damp, and I'm going to mix up the brightest color that we have yet for the water. I'm going to grab a hint of this bright aqua green, I'm going to grab a hint of this light blue permanent, I'm going to mix those together, I'm going to grab some titanium white, mix up something very bright, brightest thing we've made yet. I'm using this small brush because it's great for details, and I'm going to create these highlights and waves in the foreground. And these are really going to look like very elongated N shapes. So I start from the bottom, I'll move up, and then I'll move back down. And I want the top of this shape to be the brightest. So I'll go back in and I might do a little bit of a tapping motion to give it some added texture, movement, splashing effect. but this is going to give it some extra detail. And remember, you get the detail as you move into the foreground. Right now, my layer under it is still a little bit wet, so it's blending to a point, which is nice in that it's making it nice and natural. But it's also hindering my very sharp line work. So that's something to consider. Here, I'll make a couple soft strokes as we move into the background. I'll let it blend a little bit more, so I'm applying more pressure with my brush. If you want the paint to really stick out like this, be a little bit textured, kind of protrude, don't apply a lot of pressure, because the more pressure you add with your brush, the more you push the pigment into the canvas and you blend those pigments. So I'm avoiding that right now in the foreground. I'm trying to apply as little pressure as I can to get as much detail as I can, but because the layer underneath is wet, it is going to blend it to a point. So that's important to be cognizant of. Here, grabbing some extra titanium white, mixing that in. Just going over these areas until I get that nice application that I want. It's a great little extra detail, which will make the foreground look much more sharp. And then occasionally I blend backwards in the stroke. So I'll make the stroke, and then I'll blend the back of it into a gradient, and I'll keep the front to be a nice sharp look to it. Now I'm going to step back from the painting again, give it a good honest look, and then we'll head back in. Now we'll come back to the water once we're done the land, but I need to work that first so that I can layer water on top of the land. So next, I'm going to take some of my burnt umber, and we'll just apply this to our palette right near the Mars Black. And we'll need a fair bit of it, so I'll apply it just like that. And now, I'm going to sit down because this is, yet again, fairly detailed. I'm going to take this same brush that we've been using. It's very versatile, as you can see, especially when we're working on a canvas of this size. And we're going to begin working on the rock in the painting. So for this, I'm going to take my burnt umber, going to move it fairly close, but into a clean area of the palette. I'm going to take my Mars Black, mix that in there as well. And I'm going to grab a hint of titanium white to give it a little bit of a gray as well. So the rock will be brown, it'll be black, it'll be gray, it'll be white. And then I'm going to use the sharp edge of my brush to go along the edges of my rock and create some nice clean lines. And I'm working on the edges first rather than the middle of the rock, because when you just apply paint to your brush and water, you'll have the most clean lines you can possibly make. You'll have the most control. And that's really where we need it. We need it along the edges, that way we don't get this chalky effect and we don't kind of have to scrub the canvas with the brush. Instead, we can just do a nice little glide. And that's really what I'm doing right here. So I'm just going over the edges, and I'm also using the corner of this brush, as you can see, to get those really detailed areas. But we'll go back in and we'll fill in the middle of this in just a little bit. There we go. Now I'm going to add some water to it and then start again. Just like this. The more water you add to it, the more thin your pigment will get. However, the more control you'll have with your brush. So it's all about deciding what you're comfortable with and how much control you want, how much you value that control. Because, as you can see, my strokes are fairly clear right there. It's because I have a lot of water. That means I'll have to do a couple layers in that area. But of course I get that nice, clean, smooth application. So again, it's all about what it's worth to you. Now I'm going to mix up a bit more of that pigment. Go over this edge again because, as we mentioned, it simply isn't that thick. And I think I want to make it a little bit more gray, so I'll throw in some extra Mars Black and Titanium White for this second layer. And I'll just kind of go over things again quickly. There we go. You can see when the brush is full of paint just how quickly you can move over these edges. And I'm trying to stay within my line, or on my line rather, for the most part, but I'm really not concerned about changing it if I feel I see a better movement for the rock. Yes, we have a reference photo, yes, we have a digital sketch, but they really can be altered in the moment if you have a surge of inspiration, you have an idea. I generally find that my paintings look fairly different, at least from a drawing perspective, in the end than they did in the beginning. Here you can see this rock was done in full, but it's fairly thin, so I will have to go back and redo that area. Here you can see I'm kind of changing my rocks a little bit, but that's okay. Really isn't a bad thing. There we are. Now I'm going to switch over to my slightly smaller square-headed brush. We'll measure this one as well. It is essentially about 1.5 centimeters. It's about 1/2 inch. I will make sure that it's nice and damp, and I'm using this one instead now because it's going to be a little bit more control oriented. I won't be able to cover as much space, but I'll get a bit more of a finer stroke and I'll be able to delegate my paint a little bit better. So in these areas where I need a little bit more control, the edges are a little bit sharper, there are more intricate pieces to them, this brush definitely helps. And here you can see now I'm going over those land masses, just like that, creating something a little bit better. Come out and work on these ones as well. This is an area that was very thin, so it'll need an entirely new application. And then with the excess paint, I'll just work that in. There we go. But you can see that it's starting to shape up. Here, we'll move in again. It's kind of neat. It works its way into a bridge here, which I like. Kind of blending the natural and the human-made portions of it. As I continue to mix this, I'm using less and less brown just because I'm finding that I don't love the brown with the teal and the greens and the blues as much as I do the gray. Gray is an incredible color as it makes all of the other colors around it heightened. It kind of puts itself in the background and it makes beautiful work of everything else. So if you ever really want to accentuate a color in a painting, add a lot of gray to the other subjects. And that's what we're doing here. We're graying this so that the water can look so much more notable. And as you can see, I'm just going back over all of my previous subjects and making them nice and thick in application. Using the corner of my brush here to be a little bit more detail oriented. Got a little bit of extra grayish brown over there, so I just made another little rock, nothing to worry about. Here I'll create a couple of them actually. Just kind of lead it out, make it slightly more interesting. I only drew on a couple here to kind of give it a shot, but I figured if I liked it, I would expand and I would add more, and that's exactly what we're doing. Tried to make them varying sizes and shapes as well. Of course, you can see how all of this turns out on the digital sketch, as it will be the ending version of the painting rather than the beginning one. That way you know exactly what we're doing and you can kind of be ahead of the curve. There we go. I like that a lot. Now I'll move forward in the painting a little bit. Again, work on the edges to begin with. I'm rotating my brush so that I get those nice clean edges where I want them. Then we'll get some extra paint. Start filling this in. I don't have enough paint to fill it in entirely cleanly. I'd have to scrape and drag, and I don't want to do that. I want a nice thick layer here. So I mixed up a little bit of paint. Didn't take me very long at all. And now we are fairly close to finishing the base layer for our rock. There we go. Do a little bit behind the lighthouse as well. Kind of lead it in there, into that side. It's fairly neat. I'm going to clean my brush, take a couple of steps back, give it an honest evaluation, and then continue working. So after reassessing, I really like how everything's turning out with the amount of rocks that we have and the way they're kind of spread out and in the shape of them themselves. So now that I like the base layer, we're going to add some highlight on it and build some depth. You can build depth in your paintings by wrapping light around your subjects so that you have multiple values, and the value is how bright or dark your painting or subject is. So this is a very dark value. Now I can go over to my brushes, we'll grab this one, should reorganize these. I'll grab my smaller square-headed brush yet again, and I'm going to take this pigment that we had, I'm going to make it a little bit brighter. And in doing so, I'm going to create a brighter value. It'll be the same color, but it'll be a brighter version of itself. And using this, I can now go into areas where I feel like light is going to be hitting and create that light. Now, it's important to ask where the light is coming from in your painting. And in this painting, it's kind of up top. It's an afternoon scene. The sun is really illuminating everything. So I'm kind of going to be doing light downwards, and that means there's going to be a lot of reflective light from the water. So it's not going to be a hard light. It's not like this side of the painting is going to be bright, this side is going to be dark. It's kind of going to be throughout. And that's a nice way to paint. So I'm going to go to the top of one of these rocks, and I'm going to start using the corner of this square-headed brush. I'm going to do a bit of a tap, and then I'm going to do a bit of a blend and a tap, and I'm just going to work my way down, creating these little paths of highlight to create the implication of texture on the rock and light hitting it. So here you can see I'm just working my way down. Once I feel like it gets a little bit too monotonous, I'll create a new strand, and then I'll build that out. As you can see, the highlight isn't incredibly bright either. It's just bright in relation to the layer that was previously applied. And through this, you can already see that we have depth. but was once a silhouette because it didn't have a change in value, now has these multiple pathways and strokes. If you want your rock to be a little bit larger and to kind of be a bit more sharp, you can take that highlight and you can create platforms, ledges. So this rock right here is much more together. It doesn't have all of this crumbling effect. It doesn't have this almost patterned effect. And as you get towards the bottom, you're going to want to do much more of that. And that's because the water is going to, over time, erode and soften the rock. So the rock up here can be much more pitter-pattery, like that, much more sharp. But then as you get down towards the bottom, you move from this tapping motion to a stroke. So again, it's a tap, 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 stroke, stroke, big stroke. And it's that transition that's going to make it quite natural. There we go. Now, of course, you can have some softer areas of rock that are occurring up here. I have this one right there. I might add one like this, just because it's a nice simple line and edge, and because of that, this will stand out a little bit better. So I'm doing it with reason, but it's something to consider. There we go. Again, I'm doing a little pitter-patter effect. Just like that. Now here, we're close to the bottom, so I'm creating these nice sharp edges, and I'm creating depth by still leaving all of these darker areas. I'd like to note here it's darker, and that's areas that will hypothetically have more shadow on them. So the light doesn't reach them, it doesn't create depth, and therefore you get this gradient and this nice effect. You can also mix up a slightly darker version, so add in a little bit of extra Mars black, and work that under this bridge, because that's not going to be receiving much light at all. You can also take that darker pigment and work it into the darkest crevices you feel there as well. And the more layers of value change that you create, the more interesting and natural the painting will look. Here, just grabbing a little bit more of our highlight. Move on to the foreground, and as you move to the foreground, you need things to be a little bit sharper. Here, I was a little bit loose. I let there be blends in my taps. But when I'm tapping here in the foreground, everything needs to be sharp. It needs to be incredibly clean, because this is where you really notice detail in the foreground. This is where the eye doesn't blend it doesn't kind of optically sink into one another. It's very distinct. And so when I'm painting in the foreground, I'm making sure that all of my lines, all of my taps are much more clean. They're also a bit larger here, you can see. And the same that goes for the waves. The waves in the distance are just horizontal lines, but here you get the movement, you get the texture, you get the stroke. And it's the same for rock and really any other subject. The closer you get to it, the more detail you're going to notice, the more sharp the lines are going to look. So I'm just kind of moving, jumping around my painting, and working on all of that. Now this rock in the background here, it's very far away, so I'm not going to do any of that tapping detail. I'm just going to do some highlights. And these highlights aren't necessarily this kind of slate rock that you've incorporated here in the foreground that's much more defined and together. It's more so this tapping effect, maybe, but far away it looks blended and it looks together. So that's what we're doing with that one. These little ones down here will have a lot of water crashing on them at all times, so they'll be fairly smooth. And I'm just going to create some line work on them. It's not going to have much of that tapping effect at all. It's important to think about where your subject is and the effect the natural world will have on it, as that will determine a lot in your landscape paintings. There we go. Now, I've done that layer of adding value, so I'm going to, again, take a step back and give it an honest look. And as I'm looking at it, again, I like it a lot. But we have very bright values here on the right and left-hand side, and I want to continue that to a point up here. I don't want them to be as bright, as the water is our main attraction, along with our lighthouse, but I want it to stick out just a little bit more. So I've mixed in a little bit of additional titanium white, create a slightly brighter pigment. And now for my rock here in the foreground, I'll do some additional tapping. I'll go over areas that we've done before, ones that we're very sure about, ones that do receive a lot of light, but also create slightly new ones, and just continue to add and improve. The more little markings you can have and more little paths and lanes in your rock, the more real and interesting it's going to look. So the more time you have for this, the better, really. Again, the top areas can be much more tappy. The bottom are a bit sharper. This stroke didn't really go over that well, so I have a very wet brush. I'm just going to kind of blend it out like that. And there, now I have an application I actually like. While acrylics dry fairly quickly, generally you do have a grace period where you can go back over something, soften it, or take it out entirely with the right amount of water on a clean brush. You notice while I grabbed water there, I did clean my brush quickly. That way I wasn't applying additional water, I wasn't applying additional paint, I was just putting on that water to scrape it off. Here we go. Amazing how well this is all turning out. Haven't done a scene like this since, probably 9 months ago. It's amazing how time flies. But I think we do tend to think of these scenes around the winter. We miss the beach, we miss the water, and so we create those wonderful things in our heads on the canvas. But I think that turned out really, really well. I like that a lot. So from there, I'm going to move on to the next step in our painting, which is adding water rushing up onto the rock. So I'm going to take the same small square-headed brush because it's great for detail. I'm going to grab some titanium white, move that out into a clean spot here on our palette. I'll grab a little bit of our bright aqua green, but not much. And then we'll have it running off the edges of all of this rock. So you go down to the bottom corner, and then you kind of create these lines of waves. And you do it on both sides, and then you blend it back. So the bottom of the stroke is the sharpest, and then it gets softer as you move back into the painting. And as I move back into the painting, I'll show you here, I kind of move in a Z-like pattern. So I'm moving back and forth, creating a zigzag effect. There we go. Now I'm going to take more of that, and you know what, I'll move it up here. That way we can kind of compare it to the previous light pigments we had. That way we know it's bright enough. And you can even run it up onto the land itself. Make it very wave intensive if you want. Here it's kind of rushing up. So I'm doing this stroke, this sweeping motion. And I'm going to do a little bit of a tap with the corner of the brush to create some added detail. Just like that. And that way it looks like the water's kind of erupting and breaking as it gets higher. And remember, it gets brighter as it moves up into the air because it gets less dense. More light is shown. There we go. Kind of crashing upwards. Fairly interesting. But that'll make the painting look much more dynamic. If you wanted a softer sea, softer ocean scene, I wouldn't do as much of this. But then I'm going to go back and I'm going to create all of these little Z-like patterns in the water, in the foreground as well. Kind of leading off these rocks and that application. And I'm doing this now as opposed to when we were initially working on the water, because now the water is entirely dry and these highlights will actually stand out where they wouldn't have when we were applying them earlier. I'm also going back and adding these highlights up here, but I'm doing so, again, more in a horizontal stroke. So back down to the bottom, creating nice little highlights. And now that I've painted my rocks, I have to be a little bit more careful about the edging. Otherwise, I will have to go back and repaint those rocks. But look at this side of the painting in relation to that side of the painting. This is so much more detailed. It pops. It has so much more life. It makes it look like there's real wind in the painting. So it's a very beneficial step if you want your painting to be a little bit more lively. Now here we can do it on the other side. Let's say the water comes through here. It comes through this opening, this bridge. Just have it very white right here because it's crashing against the walls and everything. And then we create that effect. So I'm moving up, moving up, I'm moving up, I'm moving up. I'm connecting areas, making it very wave-like. And then of course it crashes onto those rocks. Nice and easy. The more you do, the quicker you'll get at it. You'll learn the easier ways to connect them, and remember, we blend the tops up and we keep the bottom sharp. Can also rush around the edges of the land. Like this. So all of my rocks here get a little bit at the bottom, and it just makes it look like the water is rushing up and it's fairly transparent as it gets up there, which is a neat effect. But there we go. Now, again, I'm going to take a little bit of a break. I'm going to step back from the painting, give it that honest look, and then continue. Now we're going to have some fun, and we're going to move on to the next part of the painting, which is our laneway. Now, it's a fairly large area, but it is these very sharp lines. So instead of using a much larger brush, I'm going to go more to this medium to small sized one. To measure it, yet again, it is about 1 centimeter. It's about almost half an inch. It's missing a little bit, but it's a good start. Now I'm going to take this and I'm going to mix up a fairly dark gray. And I'm going to do that over the brownish gray that we mixed initially, just because it's a similar color and it'll give us a good relation to the rock. So here you can see it's in between the highlight and the dark color of the rock, And I'm going to start by applying this to the walls of our bridge. You can see that the sharp edge of this brush is doing a magnificent job of working its way around everything. But you can also see that the pigment is very, very thin. So that's because we have so much water on our brush, and you can see I'm just mixing more of it in there right now. So I'm going to take a lot of it off, and I'm going to mix some additional pigment right where we had it. And I'm making new pigment because that old pigment did have a lot of water in it. So now I'll go over those areas yet again. Now these areas will have a bit of water in them still because that paint and that water will still be wet. But the fact that we don't have any additional on our brush right now will mean that it'll balance itself out fairly well. And as you can see, we're quickly bringing this to a nice thick application. Here I'm just using the corner of my brush and working it through. Now I'm going to move over to this side of the painting. Remember, when we work in detailed areas like this, we work on the edges first, because that's when we have the most paint, when we're able to create the most well-developed lines. Just moving back and forth. I'm dragging my pigment, but I'm not doing it because I don't have enough. I'm doing it because it helps me keep a steady, continuous application. Now, I've got it a little bit wet, not as much as before, but we'll make some additional paint. And we'll paint in more of the side of our bridge. I'm being fairly sharp along the rocks, but I'm not too worried about it because the colors are just so similar. Now that I have my edges worked out, I can just move in and finish this area, which is nice. There we go. Now, I'm going to switch to my smallest square-headed brush. I'm going to make a slightly darker color yet again, and I'm going to paint the inside of this bridge, which isn't going to be receiving really any light but reflected light from the water, so it's going to be quite dark, just like that. Nice, subtle detail for the painting. I like it a lot. It's just this added extra piece, which we didn't have to include, but it was in the reference photo, so it was a great idea and a great addition. Now, I'm going to take some of that extra Mars Black titanium white mixture, and I'm going to work it along the edge here of our, I suppose it's not a railing, but protruding piece which ensures that the vehicles or horses do not end up in the rocks or water. Very important. So again, working on my edges, using that sharp edge, and then I'll move in to that middle area. There we go. Nice and easy. Touch up this a little bit. There was a thin area. Just make sure that it's nice and thick. Then grab a bit more, and we'll work on this inner piece as well. It's much smaller, so as you can see, there probably won't have to be much filling in, as the stroke with this brush works for all of it. Great. And just like that, we are so much closer to finishing this lovely little painting. Now, before I continue working on this, I want to let that dry for the most part because I want to come in and fill this in, but I want to wait for this to dry so that they don't bleed into one another and blend. I want that nice sharp line. So I'm going to take a 5-minute break, let that dry fully, and then jump right back into it. Now, to be entirely honest with you, while I was waiting for that to dry, I did notice that it was drying fairly thin and that I didn't have a truly thick application. It was still very watery. So I went back, I did another little layer just over this strip and that strip, and then I let that dry fully. But just so you know, in case you have a thin layer and it isn't the right opacity throughout the entirety of it, if it's kind of mixed, some areas are brighter than others, I simply implore you, go back, add an extra layer, and then we can move on to this middle laneway, which I'm going to continue using this fairly small square-headed brush for. So yet again, I'm going to make sure that it's nice and damp, which yes, means we may have to do an additional layer, but that's all right. I'm going to take some of my titanium white, mix that on top of / in our previous mixture, and create something that, while isn't bright, is bright in relation to our previous application. So here's what we were just using. Here is our new mixture. And with this, I'm going to work along the edges of the top of, again, what we'll call the railing. And I'll just move it all the way about, working through my edges, rotating my brush so that the edge of the brush is always on the same axis as the line we are trying to work beside. So you can see right here. And I'm just going to move it down as far as I can. And now with the excess paint on my brush, I'm just going to move it in a little bit with horizontal strokes for the most part, though if I do a little bit of an X-shaped pattern, I'm not too worried. This is meant to be more of a concrete look, and it can be a little bit more disheveled. Now I'm going to mix up a bit more of that paint, as I do not have that much, and I want to be able to create a long, consistent line like I just did. So here, I'm moving the other way, just out of convenience. Working my way along that railing, coming up, getting close to this turn. And I don't think this angle of holding the brush is going to work as well as I'd like. So I'm going to change it again. I'm going to use my pinky finger as a kind of grounding to help me keep my hand steady. And there you can see I'll make a new stroke and it'll work really well. Now that that area is fairly filled in, I'll just come back and apply another layer here to the middle. Kind of catch us up here. Clean off my brush, grab some more pigment, create that edge line. Have a good number of edge lines here. Being very careful, and then blend the middles. There we go. It's a really beautiful leading line that moves us up into the lighthouse. From there, I will add the tops of our railings here, and I'm going to do so with this same pigment right here for this outer one. Now this, again, isn't a large area, so I'm not really working on the edges, I'm more so creating a consistent stroke, but I'm doing it with a myriad of strokes, as you can see, just because it'll help me be a little bit more consistent. Rather than if I made one stroke and I kind of went off the rails, moved quickly or inappropriately in the wrong direction. But now you see an issue in that when we get over here, we're painting this color, which is the same as this color, right beside each other, so you don't have much of a difference. So there, I'm going to take an artistic liberty, and that means changing the picture or image from reality to heighten the image. that you're painting to make it look a little bit better. So I'm going to make this part of the railing a little bit brighter, that way it stands out, even though technically it may not be so in reality. And here I'm just using the corner of my brush, as I need to make very small strokes. As I move to the larger areas like this, I can use that guiding motion again. I also have the option of taking this brush, making sure that I take most of the paint off of it so that it doesn't dry inappropriately. I'm grabbing my smallest square-headed brush and continuing from there with that. Again, it's one of those things where it'll take more time, but you'll get a smaller, cleaner stroke. So it's all about how you want to allocate your time in your painting. Here, as you can see, the top of the railing is now larger than the siding, which isn't good. And that happened because I was using the larger brush, and I probably shouldn't have been for this area. And so with that, I now need to go back and redo that siding. I'm going to continue working on this top area while I have the pigment on my palette, while I have this brush out, but I will go back to that area, and I'm doing that again just because I probably should have used a smaller brush and more care. But that's okay, we can go back and we can touch that up. It's important not to get down on your mistakes in painting, but just to learn from them and get better. Now here I'm going to mix a much brighter gray for this part of the railing, just because it is beside the bright concrete and I want it to stand out. Again, an artistic liberty like what we took up there. Just going it over a couple of times. Just like that. Now we'll mix up a bit of our darker gray yet again, so that I can fill in this inner wall. The railing really shouldn't be large around here. If it gets lost a little bit, that's okay. It would make sense in the context of the image itself. I'm going to be honest with you, this painting is taking longer than I expected it to, but it's also looking better than I expected it to, and I think there's a good lesson in that. There's nothing wrong with putting extra time into your painting, especially when you want to create something special. There we go. Now I'm going to take a couple of steps back, again give myself a very honest look at it. I think it's going really well. Oh, that's wonderful. Okay, great. So from there, let's continue the painting by hopping into the lighthouse right here. And before we do that, I'm going to clean my water because we're going to be working with very, very light colors, close to white. And if we were going to use this water, then it would dilute it. This water is now very gray, it's very blue. So if I took a clean color on my brush and I dipped it in there, they would mix to a point, and so I wouldn't get the color I want. So it's important to clean your water when you want to work with new clean colors, and that's what we're going to do. So I'm going to take a 2-minute break, clean my brush, clean my water, clean these brushes as well, just because you might as well keep them in good health, and then we'll get right back to it. Now that I have clean water and clean brushes, I'm ready to move on with a new color in the painting. And that color is going to be this, oh my, that's upside down, cadmium red medium hue. I'm going to take that just apply a tiny bit. We're not going to be using much at all. And I'm going to take also my smallest square-headed brush, as you can see right here. I'm going to make sure that it's nice and wet. I'm going to grab a little bit of titanium white, throw it over here, grab a hint of that red, mix them together, and then I'm going to create the first strokes on my lighthouse. And this is going to be a fairly muted red, and I'm a-okay with that. I don't want it overtaking the rest of the landscape, and we're muting the red by using that titanium white. Generally a titanium white will make it a little bit more pink, but we're not using much at all. We're just using enough to thin it down and create something a little bit more subtle. But I think we need to incorporate just a little bit of red in our lighthouse. So I'm going to put it right there and then on the top as well. I'm still rotating my brush so that the edge of it, again, is on the axis of the line I'm trying to keep sharp. And I'm just moving around, as so. There we are. Nice and easy. Now, of course, we need to make it look three-dimensional, so we'll grab a little bit of Mars Black, and I do mean a little bit, the smallest amount possible. We'll mix that over into our red, wipe off the excess, and then I'm going to apply this at the very bottom of our application and then just blend up slightly. Because this bottom area, it's going to receive much more shadow than it is light, and it's going to give us a little bit of depth. I'm also going to throw in a little bit up here to create some separation in the lighthouse pieces. Just like that. Again, very easy, very simple. Creates a little bit of depth in no time at all. Now I'm going to take my titanium white, I'm going to move that to a new spot here on my palette. I'm going to grab a little bit of burnt umber, and I do mean a little bit. I just want to create a bit of a incredibly light brown, as you can see. And this is going to be the color for my lighthouse. It looks like a beige in relation to everything else. So it doesn't stand out too much, but it is a new pigment. I'm currently painting over the windows. I'm not too concerned about those. We can go back in and fill that in later. There we go. Just an aside, because I think we will probably work on some faces and people throughout this coming year now that we're working in the longer lessons with the larger canvases. When I was in high school, I thought that you would mix skin tone, mostly Caucasian skin tone, with a burnt umber and a titanium white, and then you would get a beige, as you can see here. Do not do that. That is not a good way of mixing skin tones. Is it semi-close? Yes. However, our skin has reds and blues and green tones, all of these different things showing through, and that's how you get a truly vibrant human being and vibrant skin tone. It isn't simply through this palette. Don't use this for skin. We will probably in the future paint people, at which point we will talk about how to do that appropriately. But this is predominantly a landscape painting channel, so I'm not going to talk too much about that. It was a mistake I made in the beginning that I felt it necessary to warn you of. There are plenty of great YouTube videos out there that talk about how to paint skin tone appropriately, so look those up if that's something you intend on doing, or wait for me to make a lesson on it at some point. With that said, getting back to the lesson, here I'm going to mix up a bit more of that beige, that very light brown, because we're painting this light pigment over the dark pigment that is the water and the ocean. And we had that blue here, and as you can see, it's kind of showing through a little bit, and that's because acrylic paints are semi-transparent, specifically lighter pigments. So while we have titanium white, which is technically a thicker pigment, it's still showing through, and we need to use a lot of paint to cover that up. So you can do that through layers and time, or you can simply take a lot of paint, as I'm going to attempt to do here, and just cover it up with sheer volume and thickness. Oh, there we go. That worked really well. You can still see it a little bit, but we will add in an additional layer, grab some extra paint. Perfect. We were able to do it. There we go. But of course, this is a three-dimensional subject, so like the rest of our lighthouse, we do need to add some depth. So I'm going to grab a hint of Mars Black. You can probably see just how small of an amount that is, and I'm even going to take some off. I'm going to use as little Mars Black as possible in this mixture, and then I'm going to throw this at the bottom, and then I'm just going to do some strokes upwards. It's going to be a little bit more impressionistic, and then I'll blend. But this way the bottom of the lighthouse looks like it's a little bit darker. It has a little bit of shadow cast upon it, slightly farther away from light. Here I'll go in and I'll mix a little bit more, run it up the side, run it up the middle, and then do this like very quick little tapping motion to blend it all together. But just like that, again, it's much more subtle, and we have this three-dimensional effect. Then I'll grab some Mars Black, mix that in over with our grays and our titanium white to have a very dark mixture. And I will create some railings right here, as you can see, for our lighthouse. Using the smallest of square-headed brushes for this because it's very delicate. There we are. Continuing to add detail wherever possible. Sharpening these edges as well. Moving this pigment around, making sure that it's nice and cohesive. And we'll even blend some into the lighthouse itself. There we go. Now we're going to move down to the bottom where you have this kind of concrete base. So I'll mix up a nice dark gray, Mars Black, titanium white. Doing it again right on top of our previous applications, that way we know what we're working with. Just like that. Going to make it a little bit darker now and fill in kind of this circular piece so it wraps around. This is the inner portion that isn't receiving as much light because it'll have more shadow cast upon and in it. And then down here we have more of that roadway, so I'll make this inner area. And then I'll just fill that in, nice and easy. Right here is just an extension of this. But with more shadow because we have the lighthouse right above it. Then we have a little house here. So I'll take some of my burnt umber, throw that next to my Mars Black. You can barely tell the difference because it's such a dark pigment, but I'll throw a little bit of titanium white in there. We can paint that in. And as you can see, it's very stark in relation to everything else, which isn't what we want. So I'm going to make it more gray by throwing some additional Mars Black and titanium white into it. Now it'll be a very subdued brown, which isn't a bad thing. We can create little wood boards by taking some of our whitish, brownish gray, just working those all up vertically. And then we can take more of our red and create a nice little roof with it with some titanium white, the same color we used for the top of the lighthouse. we can just throw that on there as well. Now, of course, we need a nice little door for it, so I'll grab some Mars Black and some burnt umber. We'll make a very dark mixture. Paint in a nice little door. Now we'll paint some light in our painting. So I'll switch over to my smallest round-headed brush because it has a feathered rounded edge. So it doesn't generally make sharp edges, it makes them that they're kind of more of a gradient. The middle of the application is much more dense and opaque, and then as it moves out, it gets less so and more transparent, which is great for the effect of emitting light. So I'm going to make sure this is nice and damp, grab some titanium white, move that out on my palette. You can probably see it right there. Then I'll create a nice little window of light in there, and of course our light up here. It won't shine incredibly brightly because of course we're in the middle of the day. It's already very bright, but just the idea that there's a little bit of extra light there that's on is interesting. There I added an extra little window, and I don't like that. So I'm going to make a very wet brush, move it up and down, then use my finger to try to get rid of it. Because the layer underneath was still wet, it didn't have the effect I wanted and it didn't come off. So I'm just going to repaint that little bit of the house by taking some of that burnt umber, a little bit of that Mars Black, titanium white, just remixing a similar pigment. And we'll try playing that. There we go. Easy fix. Now, I'm going to yet again take a couple steps back from my painting and give it a good, honest look. Make sure that everything is balancing itself out well. When I stepped back to look at the painting, I noticed that this area right here, I'm going to look in the monitor again, yeah, it's too bright. It doesn't have real depth in relation to everything else. Like, it makes sense contextually because the light's up top and it's going to give it a fairly even light around it. So it makes sense, but in the context of our painting, it doesn't look as good as it can. And that's important to note, whether you're going for realism or if you're trying to aid your painting to the best of your ability. And in this, we've already taken artistic liberties here in the railings and making some lighter and some darker. So I'm going to continue with that. I'm going to take some artistic liberties there with our lighthouse. Yes, I did just accidentally touch it, get it on my finger, and then wipe it off. Thing to note, if you apply a lot of paint, it will take longer to dry. But with that said, I'm going to go back to my smaller square-headed brush, and I'm going to make the edges of this darker so that the front of it's the brightest, and it'll look like the light is in the middle, and then it gets darker on either side, as if the light is going directly towards it, which, again, isn't the initial idea in the context of the painting. But because we have this row of light that leads into it, I think it'll look natural unless you really think about it. And I think there are ways of justifying it in nature, but it wasn't what we initially meant to do, but it is something we can do and something I think will aid the painting. So again, these are all things to consider while you're painting. Realism is rarely ever my goal in the end. I think it's much more about creating the feeling, the atmosphere, the emotion of the image, the subject itself. So rather than creating something that looks real to me, I will create it with colors and lines that really evoke the feelings that that image, subject, or place were meant to evoke. So it's more of an imaginative way of creating, I suppose. But it's don't ever think of realism as wrong, or a more creative version of that as wrong, or surrealism, any of it. it's all personal preference. It's all what you want to get out of your painting. You can make your painting more real by leaving it like this, or you could add the edges like I'm about to make it pop more. So again, just consider what you want out of a painting and then paint for that. Again, if you are following my tutorials to a T, you are generally going to sacrifice realism in a couple of areas to heighten the atmosphere and the mood of it, to heighten the idea of it, because that's how I like to paint and that's how I like to render things. But it's just something to consider. I love now that we're doing these longer videos so that I can just talk about all of these ideas. But we will now get back to the painting. So I'm going to take some of my Mars Black, move that off here. I'm going to take a little bit of our burnt umber. I'm going to take some titanium white, mix up a bit of a darker beige, gray, brown. And now I'm going to apply this to the edge. I can already tell this is going to have a big impact on the depth. Now I'm going to make sure my brush is clean, nice and damp, and I'm going to blend in these edges. Just like this. Trying to create a gradient where the middle is the brightest and the edges are the darkest. Grab a little bit more Mars Black, mix that in. It's just that the bottom here has so much of these dark values and the lighthouse doesn't. Which again, it can happen, it makes sense in reality, but it just doesn't look as good as it could. So that's why we're doing what we're doing. Again, I made that edge line and then I blended. And if you make things too dark, don't worry about it. You can always go back in and repaint in the light, which we'll do right now by taking a lot of titanium white, moving that up into the mixture we were working with, and then applying that right here on top. And then of course, we'll need to blend. I have a lot of water and wet paint on here, so I tried to take off as much water as I could from my brush. Well, it's generally good to have it fairly damp. It isn't always conducive. There we go. Also going to take a hint of our red, pure red, and just throw it up on the top here. Make it pop a little bit more. Just give it this very natural, beautiful color. Now, I'm going to step back, as we do. And that looks so much better. Wow. Okay, I'm glad we did that. See, sometimes you need to try things and expand, and I think that definitely gave it a lot of extra depth. So from there, I'm going to clean my brushes, my water, and I'll be right back. Now that we have some clean water, we have some clean brushes, we're going to head back into our painting and continue to work with our favorite color of the painting, which is apparently a gray. I'm going to mix up a little bit of our titanium white, and I'll pick a new spot on the palette, that way it's more easily discernible. I'm going to take a hint of Mars Black. I'm going to create more of this mid-tone gray. Might need a little bit more titanium white for it. But I'm going to take this and I'm just going to work in some bricks down here. I think it can be a really neat added effect. Create some extra detail. And as you can see, I'm trying to follow the line that's up here and just create as many of these little pieces as I can. The more we do, the more added detail it has, the more interesting the painting will be. And by just taking the square-headed brush and moving back and forth, you can create so many little perfect implications in bricks. That said, your bricks don't need to be perfect, because this really isn't meant to be a modern structure. And you know, you can kind of give it more character by making things a little bit more rough, obtuse. So here I'm getting farther and farther away, and as I do that, I'm letting my strokes get smaller and smaller. I'm applying less pressure. I'm not wiggling my brush as much to get the bricks as large. But we're definitely creating that implication and detail back there, which is great. Then, over here, I'm just going to do little taps with the corner of my brush. Again, in that same direction as the railing. We're getting smaller and smaller as we get farther and farther away. And eventually, I'm letting it just naturally dissipate on my brush, so I'm getting less and less pigment, less and less water. And as I do that, it makes sense because we're going to see less and less bricks. Here I'll just have a couple larger markings that'll kind of imply bricks and that sort of thing in the background, but I'll stop making them around this point. Head back to my palette, grab a little bit more, make a couple larger bricks right up here in the front, just trying to create this transition from small bricks to really small bricks to no bricks, but the implication of markings and such. There we go. Again, just another easy little detail for that painting. Again, getting up, stepping away. And you know what? With that, I think we can pretty much call it. I am incredibly happy with this painting and how it turned out. And okay, I know I just said we were done, but I had two more ideas and I figured why not give it a try. The first is very simple. We're taking this smaller square-headed brush. We're just moving a little bit of very watery paint with Mars Black over here, a hint of titanium white, just a little bit. And finding a nice little open area in the sky. And we'll just create some birds. A little sign of life. I'm going to do 3 of them, just right there, make it nice and easy, very simple. That's thought number 1. Thought number 2 is moss. We have a lot of water, we have a lot of rock, we have hints of green. Why not throw in some actual interesting green? So here I'm going to take some of our cadmium yellow deep hue. I'm going to take some of our bright aqua green, blend those two together. I'm going to take a little bit of Mars Black to create a darker mixture to begin with. And I'm just going to work this in a tapping motion throughout some of the bottom areas initially of our rock. It's just going to be a subtle hint of color initially. Just doing it with a little pitter-patter effect. By the way, the yellow and the Mars Black will make a green by themselves. However, the addition of the bright aqua is going to make it much more cool, whereas the black and the yellow will naturally make much more of a warmer olive green. So I'm just working this through some of the darker areas, as that's probably where the moss will grow naturally. There we go. Can do a lot over here. Don't have too much going on in this area. A little bit under the bridge, in the distance. And then we can take a little bit more of those two brighter colors, minus the Mars Black. Take some titanium white, mix it all together. Create a highlight, and then again with a little bit of a tap and drag, we can create highlight for our moss. Really interesting little touch of color that our painting didn't have before, but it could surely use. Just an added little piece of detail. Now, the tutorial is going quite long at this point, so I'm not going to include it in today's lesson, but another idea, if you wanted to take the time, you could also put a car or a wagon or something going down the lane. Maybe some kids biking. Lots of different options. But just a thought. Came to me here at the very end as I thought to add the moss and the birds. I thought, hey, that could really work well. But again, I don't want this painting to be too long. So I think this is where we'll leave it at today. Just trying to add enough moss that it looks natural in the landscape. That it isn't kind of segregated to one area or another. It's cohesive, it works throughout. There we go. And you know what? While I'm here, I'm just going to throw in a little bit. I do mean a little bit. There's some extra highlights rushing up onto the land. We have some really nice ones, but I think we could do just a little bit more. There we go. And you know what? Yet again, probably, hopefully for the last time, there we have it. Well, there we have it. That is today's hour-long painting lesson. Congratulations on making it through another one. I truly hope you enjoyed, and I hope that out of this you get a fantastic painting that you're incredibly proud of. I'll be doing another one for next Saturday, so make sure that you hit the bell button down below. That way you're notified when it goes live, and just so we get to see each other, so we get to have these conversations and make these great paintings again. Truly, thank you for stopping by. If you've watched the video and intend on now going and doing the painting, remember that the digital sketch and reference photo are up over on Patreon, and if you're a part of the Facebook group, please share that over there. I'd love to see it and have a conversation about it too. So thank you so much for tuning in. I will see you next week, and above all, as always, stay creative.